Hey listeners, welcome back to another out-of-world news story with Unraveled Tales, where time itself unravels its captivating tales and reveals the hidden secrets of the past. Prepare to embark on an extraordinary journey as we delve into the depths of history and bringing you riveting and immersive real stories from different eras. Today's story is about Opus is 88 years old, and at this point, he is explaining to you what is going on inside his mind regarding his wife and children. I hope you all enjoying this long story. Okay, let's go on to the story. I am Vincent, my family and I own 2 food processing plants in Virginia as well as a chain of electronic outlets in every state on the East Coast. But my biggest achievement, the one I'm most proud of, is the Vincent law firm that my children have helped me build over the years. You see, I am a lawyer, or should I say I was a lawyer when I was young. I am now 88 years old, and right now, as I explain to you what is going on inside my mind, I am in a hospital stretched on my deathbed. Yes, doctors discovered a year ago that I had liver cancer. I was told yesterday that I was going to meet my maker in a few hours. My children came to visit me every day before. I have seen many tears in their eyes and I know that they all love me very much. Now I am supposed to rest, but my mind is in the process of recapturing all the important events that happened in my life before this final trip. I have nothing to complain with my life, well, very little. Except for a few wrong decisions I made and a few bad deeds, which were done over the years and of which I am ashamed and ask the good Lord to forgive me. I sincerely believe that I have lived a good life. I also know that I will be leaving my mark on this world. But by far, the greatest feat in my entire life, and that which I am the most proud of, was raising my children in the path of rightness and fairness and planting in their mind the notion of always respecting others. You see, my wife and I, we raised a family of 3 children, 2 boys and 1 girl. Every single one of them is now married and with children of his or her own. But what makes it so special about my children is not the fact that my wife and I raised them to become good and caring individuals. No, in those days when my wife and I began working on our family, it was expected of young couples to have children and for parents to guide them on the right path in life. No, what makes it so special for me is the fact that when I was a young teen, it was in the early 40s then, I became very sick. For 2 days and 2 nights I had a very high fever. I did get well after a week or so, but later in life when I was older, I learned that the fever had affected my capacity to have children. When I had myself checked after a few years of married life, and once I realized that my wife was still not in the family way, I was told by my doctor that my sperm count was 0. In other words, I would never be able to father children. Now you might ask yourself, how is it possible for me to be the father? Some might suggest that I married a widow with children and raised them as my own. Others might believe that we started adopting children once we were married. No, we didn't do anything like that. Let me tell you how it all happened. I was born in the year 1922 in a small town on the east coast of the United States. My father abandoned my mother just a few years after I was born, and when I was 5, my mother died of tuberculosis. I don't even remember my mother's face and have never seen a picture of her. It was not very common to take picture in those days, but I was told later that she was very pretty and that she loved me a lot. After the death of my mother, I went to live with my grandmother in a large house on the fringe of a small town called Rockridge. In those days, life was simple and difficult. Half of the children of my age didn't go to school at all, and the other half either had rich parents or had to work at home while attending school. But even though I had not been born into a rich family, I was still one of the lucky ones since my grandmother insisted that I completed my secondary education once I had graduated from primary school. So, for the next 4 years I was among the privileged one that attended Rockridge Secondary School. Even though it was not common for someone to graduate from high school in those days, this was still not enough for my grandmother. She then insisted that I should go to college as soon as I was done with my high school education. By then WWII was just ending and the world economy was starting to roll again. Of course, money was still very tight for us. This plus the fact that I had to board in a big city so as to continue with my schooling was causing hardship on both of us. Soon Grandma had to sell part of the farm to pay for my expenses. Then 6 months before I was to graduate as a lawyer, my grandmother, who was my only living relative, died in her bed. It was 1944 then and I was 22. That year I graduated and became a lawyer. Right after my graduation, I sold my grandmother's house as well as the rest of the land around the house, and with the money from the sale of the farm, I bought a car and a small house in Rockridge. Until then I hadn't had the time or the money to go out with girls very often, my only experiences with the opposite play being the half-dozen dates that I had. Of course I did get to kiss some of them. This is about as far as my experience had gone with girls by the time I graduated. It was just a few months after I began working that I met my future wife. I had been hired to work for a small law firm in Rockridge and I was earning very good money. On weekends I used to jump in my car and ride around the countryside enjoying the scenery. In my heart I was still a country boy and I didn't like living in the city. On one of those rides, while driving into the countryside about 30 miles from home, I was riding on a poorly maintained road. and admiring the many trees on each side of the narrow road when I heard a strange clacking coming from the motor of my car. For the last 20 minutes I hadn't seen any traffic, and until I heard that strange noise coming from my motor, I was feeling very good while admiring the countryside. Then a few seconds after hearing the noise, the motor went dead. The car had just enough momentum for me to guide it safely to the side of the road. Of course I did open the hood and had a look inside, but since I knew very little about cars, I realized that I needed help. The closest building I could see was the steeple of a small church about 2 miles ahead and way to my right. I could tell that it was located on a side road, therefore I began to walk across the fields on a straight line path toward the church. When I got there half an hour later, I noticed a well-kept house situated a couple hundred feet from the church. I immediately walked to the house and knocked on the door. As soon as the door opened, I experienced something I had never felt before in my life. It was as if the young woman standing in front of me had a strange power over me. I just stood there in front of her speechless, and I couldn't take my eyes off her. She was about 20 and of average height. She was certainly not a beauty queen, but neither was she ugly. There was something about her that made me want to keep on looking at her. Even though I didn't realize it at the time, I felt in love with her on that first meeting. Her name was Mary Beth Goldman. She was the only child of the minister. She was living with her mother and father in the house next to the church. I learned a couple of weeks later that even thought she was 20, she had never traveled farther than 50 miles from her house. I soon realized also, after I got to know her better, that she was unbelievably naive for a girl of her age. Mary Beth, or Beth as I preferred to call her, had a strange effect on me from that first day I saw her. I felt extremely attracted to her. On that day, as she stood in front of me in the doorway of her house, she was wearing a knees-length plaid jumper with a long sleeves, white blouse underneath. It wasn't long before I started dating Beth. At first her father didn't approve of me, but her mother did, and since Beth was already 20 and old enough to choose for herself, I gradually got to know her better as we dated. The first time I kissed her, she was surprised at first. Even though she didn't protest, she didn't cooperate either. We would pretend to be going to a movie, and most of the times I would take her to my house where we would kiss and explore each other's body. Less than 9 months after we had met, we were married and she moved into my house with me. By then Beth was dying to start having children, and since I was now doing extremely well as a lawyer, we bought a much larger house in Rockridge Heights, a house with a lot of land all around it. The house as well as the whole street was situated on a tall and long ridge on the southern part of town. It provided a wonderful view of the town itself below us as well as the wide river a few miles away. It was a very large house and it had been built 50 years previously, but it was still in a very good condition. Beside a new roof and painting, it needed very little repair. We had neighbors on both sides of us, but since most of the houses on that street had been built on large estate lots, our neighbors were at least 100 yards on each side of us. In front of us, on the other side of the street, there were no houses since the rock ridge was not wide enough on that side of the street for houses to be built there. At the back of the house there was a wood that led to a small road behind our street. We therefore had all the privacy we wanted and were still close enough to the town below us. To the left of our house lived a couple that had no children. They were the Eriksson. Sven Eriksson was Swedish by birth and he was 30. He had already been married to his American wife Alexandra for a couple of years. Alexandra was about Beth's age, but unlike my wife, she had long dark hair and was shorter than Beth. She was very pretty and laughed all the time. As soon as we moved into our new house, both women became very good friends. Sven and I didn't catch up like the women did. As a matter of fact, I found him self-centered and very arrogant. Therefore, even though our wives were good friends and were visiting each other all the time, I had to force myself to be nice to Sven. I suppose he didn't appreciate my company more than I did, and we only talked to one another on those special occasions when the four of us were eating together in the yard. I soon learned that Sven's family had moved to America when he was a young lad. His father had been in the business of winemaking. Sven was now the owner of his father's business, and he had a dozen employees working full-time for him in a downtown location. He even had 4 or 5 brands of wine that were sold in half of the states in the country. In the constant and ideal temperature of his large basement, he was always experimenting and making new kinds of wine. It must be mentioned here that deep below some of the houses on the ridge where both of our houses were situated, there were many natural caves linked with man-made tunnels deep below in the rock. These had been used a century earlier to store contraband merchandise. Since the main tunnels had an exit that led to the river, this system had also been used during the Prohibition to hide and ship illegal liquors by means of the river. Sven's parents had immigrated to America from Sweden and they were both dead now. As for Sven, he was the typical looking Viking type, but I didn't like him at all. He had this egocentric attitude about himself, and more than once I watched him looking at my wife in ways that left nothing to the imagination. I even told Beth a few times about this, but it seemed to amuse her and it just made her laugh. She would then ask me if I was really jealous of Sven. Update: if Opus ever becomes a father, it will be a miracle, but one day his wife tells him the terrible news. She is pregnant. How is this possible? Check out the update. We had been living in our new house for a full year now and still Beth was not pregnant. So one day, she suggested that we should both go and see our family doctor so as to check if there was something wrong with either of us. She got a separate appointment for each of us, and when I came home the following Monday, she immediately threw her arms around my neck telling me that she was in perfect health to have babies. She was now eager to know what the doctor would tell me since my appointment was on Friday of the same week. Well, after answering many questions, the doctor got a sample of my sperm and he examined it through a microscope. I was then shocked to learn that my sperm count was nil, 0. In other words, if I should ever become a father, it would be a miracle. It seemed that the fever I had while I was a teen had destroyed my capacity for making those little swimmers that were needed to make babies. I was devastated. I couldn't even try to imagine how Beth would react to this news. After all, she was extremely eager for us to start having children. I then realized that adoption was our only option now, but I was not really keen to do that yet. Therefore, I made up my mind to tell my wife a little lie. I knew that sooner or later I would have to tell her the truth, but I wanted to wait a little before telling her the bad news. So when I got home that day, I told her that there was nothing wrong with me and we should have no problem having children of our own. So life moved on. One day, a couple of months after my visit to the doctor, I noticed the first of a series of signs that something was rotten in Denmark, or in my case, something was not exactly as it should be with my wife. First of all, the meals she would prepare for me when I got home each day were not as elaborate as they used to be. We were now eating a lot more simple things like cold meats and salads. Then I noticed that the house was not spick and span as it used to be a few months previously. Of course, the house was still clean, but small things like the bed not being nicely made as it had always been and the washing of clothing was not always done on time as it used to be. Even the dishes would often remain in the sink for half the day. Another thing I noticed also was that she was now much more careful with the way she would dress in the house. I couldn't explain those changes at all. Of course, I didn't make too much of a fuss over it. Then a couple of weeks later, I got a terrible shock. As soon as I arrived home from work one day, she told me the dreadful news. She was pregnant. Of course, she was expecting me to be overwhelmed with joy as soon as she made that revelation to me. She was extremely excited and all smile when she said this to me. She even threw her arms around my neck and glued her lips to mine, expecting me to share her joy. "Are you happy, Vincent? We will finally be a family. You will be a father and I will soon be a mother. It's a wonderful surprise, Beth. I had almost given up hope on our capacity to have children. I know it means a lot to you and of course I am very happy." Deep inside, I didn't know what to think yet. There were only two possibilities to her being pregnant. Either the sperm test that had been done on me was wrong or my wife was cheating on me. From that day on, Beth was living in a world of her own. She immediately made plans to remodel one of the many rooms in the house for the coming baby. She also got busy buying clothing for herself and for the baby. The first question that I then asked myself was, who is she screwing around with? I spent many sleepless nights trying to figure this out and I always came up with the same answer. She must have been playing around with our neighbor Sven. After all, she was home all the time and since she didn't have a car yet to drive around, she couldn't go too far from the house. Besides, I knew for a fact that Sven's wife Alexandra would often visit her cripple mother who lived in Maple Hill about 90 miles away. Every other week she would take the train to spend a couple of days with her mom there. I had already noticed that on those days that his wife was away, Sven would remain home to experiment with his winemaking in his basement. It was too much of a coincidence. I figure that he and my wife must have also been experimenting and making a baby together. But even though she was carrying Sven's baby, she was still being so nice to me, always trying to drag me toward the couch or to our bedroom so that I could play her. If that was possible, she was even more willing and eager to have play with me all the time. Anything I wanted to do with her she would agree and she eagerly participated in doing it. Still, I knew that I had a big decision to take. Even thought I loved her very much, I had to decide on what to do. Should I get rid of her immediately or just pretend that nothing was wrong and continue? I knew that I would never find another woman like her. Besides, she did take good care of the house and me, and her cooking, when she put her heart into it, was fantastic. Therefore, I took the decision of not rushing things and see what was going to happen. Besides, if I was to leave her, I needed solid proofs of her affair. There were no DNA tests in those days, therefore I had to come up with solid proofs of their affair. Something like photos or witnesses of her actual cheating with Sven, or else use the fact that I was shooting blanks, which was something that I needed to be 100% sure. 2 weeks later, I drove to Richmond on the pretext that I had business there and I had a doctor test my sperm count again. As expected, I was told that I was completely incapable of fathering a baby, and the doctor even added that there were no hope whatsoever of that changing ever. This only confirmed what I already knew. Beth had fooled me in the worst possible way. She had let another man impregnate her and she was now planning to let me raise this baby as my own. I was now doing very well as a lawyer. I was also in the process of buying the law firm of which I was a partner only. That left me very little time to think about her cheating as well as to keep an eye on her. A couple of months went by without my being able to catch her in the act of playing with Sven. I was still devastated by what she had done to me, but at the same time my anger had abated a little. Every time I would get home from work, Beth would lift her shirt and partly pull down her skirt. No well-mannered housewife would wear slack then. And she would ask me to pass my hand over her belly to see if I could find any increase in the swelling of her belly compared to the previous day. But one thing she didn't realize was that each and every time I would look at her pregnant form, I would experience all sort of emotions. First, I would feel more anger building deep inside. Here was my loving wife standing in front of me and asking me to feel her pregnant belly that had another man's baby growing in it while she pretended it was mine. Each time she did that, I couldn't prevent myself from imagining her and Sven together laughing at me and making jokes about me. Then many questions would form in my mind. Where did they play? How many times each week were they doing it? Did she find much pleasure each time she was playing him, or had she done it only once so that she could get pregnant? What did they do exactly together? While having these thoughts, I would experience a maelstrom of emotions ranging from rage to self-pity and passing through curiosity and love. Yes, I still loved her. I soon got the answer to that last question when I came home from my office one day in the middle of the day so as to get documents that I needed. By that time she was in her 3rd month of pregnancy. The previous year I had had a contractor build an extension to our house over the large garage that was attached to it. I needed a place as a home office, and I had it built above the twin garage behind our house and connected to it. My home office had a door leading to the hall of the 2nd story of the house, and it also had an entrance with a staircase from inside the garage itself. On that day, I drove my car into the garage as I usually did. But since it was my intention to leave as soon as I had those documents that I needed, I entered my home office using the staircase inside the garage. Documents in hand, I was about to leave by the same way I had entered when I heard strange noises coming from the other side of the door leading to the hall of the house. It then hit me. I already knew that Alexandra had left the previous day to be with her crippled mother. I suddenly realized that what I was hearing was the noise that my cheating wife was making while playing. At that very moment, she was probably playing the bass next door and doing it in our house. After depositing the documents that were still in my hands on top of my desk, I quietly opened the door leading to the hall and I went inside. The racket they were making was now much louder, and I could clearly distinguish both of their voices. It wasn't until I was half a dozen feet from the first open bedroom door that I knew they were in that bedroom. I even felt some relief knowing they weren't in the bedroom I shared with my wife. The door was half open, so I positioned myself so that I could peer into the room through the vertical crack between the door and the jamb. I was shocked. Even though I knew she was cheating on me, seeing her actually play with someone else and hearing her talk about me while playing was quite an experience. My anger was rising. Update 1. Opus didn't know what decision he would make. Will he go into the room and kick them? Or will he just leave the house and pretend nothing happened? Let's see what he did in the update. Instead, I quietly walked back into my home office and sat behind my desk thinking about what I had just witnessed. I had seen more than enough, and I quietly left the house. When I got back home after work that day, Beth was even nicer to me than she used to be. She gave me my usual glass of wine and she tried to cuddle close to me as I sat on the couch. But I wouldn't have any of it, since in my mind I still had the pictures of her recent play with Sven. I was still not sure how I would react when we went to bed for the night. The constant thoughts of her recent cheating, which made a fool of me, and a need to seek revenge on her and her lover, even kicking them both. During the next few days I still felt depressed. I didn't know what to do. Should I throw her out and create a scandal, or should I just pretend I was ignorant of her affair? I must mention here that in those days, it was very uncommon for a man to leave his wife. A man divorcing his spouse wasn't something that people accepted very well, since it was looked upon as a failure on both partners in a marriage. I knew that my business would also suffer greatly if I got rid of Beth. On the other hand, I had a lot of difficulties to convince myself that Beth still loved me. Of course, she was always ready and she took good care of me and was a very good housekeeper, but did she still love me now that she was playing Sven? She probably did. But at the same time, I knew that I wasn't the only man in her life and in her heart. I was now a fool, and her respect for me was probably less than before, even if I was ignorant of her affair. But there was nothing I could do now to change what she had done. Either I accepted that fact and lived with it, or get rid of her. I took the path of least resistance, and I did nothing about her affair with Sven. I simply pretended that I was completely ignorant of her cheating. Less than a week after, gradually, she began to show more signs of her pregnancy. Every chance she had, she would still show me her swollen belly and ask me to stroke it. Deep inside, I had the feeling that it was making her feel good to be constantly reminding me of her condition. She was probably relishing on the fact that I was not the one responsible for her condition, and knowing that I was completely ignorant about the real fatherhood of her baby was probably exiting to her. Every time I watched her move in the house, even though I knew she was unaware that I was staring at her, I felt a surge of anger deep inside. I would then see in my mind those images of her playing with Sven. So life continued. Beth did carry her pregnancy to term and she gave birth to a beautiful boy that we named Tom. I could tell that she was very proud and extremely happy after the birth of Tom. A few months after the birth of Tom, I still wasn't sure if she was still carrying on her affair with Sven. But one day, barely 3 months after the birth of Tom, I got the answer to that question when she told me that she's pregnant again. Thus I knew that she and Sven were still at it. Strange as it might seem, the thing that surprised me the most was my complete indifference to her new pregnancy. It was as if she had said to me that she had bought a new hat. For one thing, I did love Tom very much, and by then I was actually considering him as my own son. I told myself, why should I feel bad about her having play with Sven? After all, she was still the loving wife I had married. Besides, she had given me a son that I wouldn't have been able to have otherwise, and no one beside her and Sven knew about the true paternity of my son. So I just kept quiet about her affair and life went on as usual. By the time she gave birth to her daughter, whom we called Anna in honor of my mother, I had completely accepted the fact that I was not the biological father of my children and that my wife was cheating on me on a regular basis. Strange as it might appear, I was even looking forward to watch her again with her lover. One thing I must say here though, had I been aware that people knew that I knew that Beth was cheating on me, it would have been a completely different matter. I would never have accepted for people to look at me either with sadness or a smirk on their face, knowing something about me that they thought I knew nothing about. In other words, I certainly didn't want anyone to know that my wife was fooling me with the neighbor. It was a Tuesday and I knew that Alexandra had left to visit her mother the previous day, so it meant that Sven would be in his house all by himself. I had noticed the previous day that Beth had dusted and cleaned the spare bedroom that she used when she was playing with Sven. So I figured that the following afternoon, while Tom and Anna were sleeping in their respective room, she and her lover would be at it again. Let us pray that my husband never find out that you are the father of all my children. Well, he must be a fool not to have noticed how much like me they look. Even a fool can see they don't look like him at all. I forbid you to say that Vincent is a fool. He is a good man and a splendid father also. I was shocked to discover that Beth hadn't reacted more to his comment about me. It did hurt me to discover that she didn't appreciate me more than that. Of course, I had always known that she wanted very much to have babies, but to discover her lack of protest when Sven was degrading me like that was quite a blow to me. For some reason that I can't even begin to explain, Beth's liaison with Sven was no longer affecting me as it should. For one thing, I was still getting all the play that I could handle from my wife, and I could tell that she really cared about me, and yes, I knew she still loved me. Besides, by then I was used to her cheating, and the fact that the fruits of her cheating were the birth of my children that I loved so very much was attenuating the fact that I was a fool. Yes, she had given me children that I would never have been able to have if she hadn't been cheating on me. I loved my children like a caring father did. I know that some might consider me a wimp and a loser, but believe me, I am none of these. I was simply making the best of my handicap. Yes, my non-existing sperm count was a fact that I had to live with and accept. I was painfully aware of that. Since it was impossible for me to be a biological father, I realized that I had to make the best of my situation and thus accept her cheating as the price to pay to have my children. Yes, they were my children. By cheating on me and getting pregnant in the process, Beth had found a way for me to show the rest of the world that I was a normal married man with a family and children of my own. No one except her and Sven knew that I wasn't the biological father of my children. More important to me still was the fact that she thought I was completely ignorant of this. I strongly hoped that this secret would always remain so, since I would have to react strongly if anyone discovered the real paternity of my children. I was now accepting what she had done to me even though I didn't approve of it. She was still having play regularly with Sven, and it no longer bothered me as it used to at the beginning of her affair. After all, she had needs, which I couldn't satisfy completely. Since they thought their cheating was a secret, I still could face both and look at them in the eyes without flinching. Yes, everyone was getting something out of their affair. I was getting a family while Beth was getting all the play she needed, and more important still, she was now a mother. Events unfolded and time moved on until I gradually found myself the father of 2 children, 1 boys and 1 girls. My wife had now been carrying on her affair with Sven for well over 10 years. By the time Beth gave birth to her 3rd baby, I was 36 and she was 34. When Alexandra's mother died the previous year, Sven's wife no longer had any reason to leave her husband for a couple of days every 2 weeks. Even though Beth and Sven had stopped playing in our house after Beth gave birth to her 3rd child, this didn't stop the dynamic duo from carrying on their activities. As a matter of fact, I knew that they were together more often now. We now had a nanny to help Beth with the children and a housemaid to cook and do housework. Being the resourceful man he was and unknown to his wife, Sven had rented an apartment in town so that Beth could meet him there twice a week, mostly in the afternoon while I was working at my office. Of course, by then she had her own car and it was relatively easy for her to join her lover during the day while the nanny was back home looking after the children that weren't old enough yet to attend school. Alexandra and Sven still had no children of their own due to a woman problem she had, and since she didn't drive a car, Sven felt very safe playing Beth in the apartment. It took Beth many hours and she had much pain when she gave birth to her third baby. Her doctor told us later that it would be very dangerous for her to have another child. Of course, by that time I figured that our family was large enough and I agreed with the doctor to stop making babies. I told him that we would take precautions so that she wouldn't get pregnant again until she was well enough to have an operation so as to prevent her from getting pregnant again. But after discussing this matter at home, I realized that it wasn't in Beth's intention to stop having children. I had to do something fast to prevent this. The only way I could see to stop her was to let them know I was aware of their affair and thus forcing them to stop playing. But by doing this I had to admit to them and probably to everyone that I was not the biological father of my children. This was going to imply that all those years I was aware they had been fooling me. It was not an acceptable option for me and yet I couldn't see any other way out of that dilemma. The more I thought about the whole mess, the less I could figure a way out of it. Having to admit that from the beginning I was aware of her cheating with Sven and worse still, letting my wife know that I already knew that I was not the biological father of my children was kicking me. I knew she was going to start meeting Sven again. I figured he wouldn't mind one bit impregnating her once again, even though it could be very dangerous for her. Final update, Opus was going to take action about Sven. See what happened in the end. I told myself that since I had to make a choice between Beth and Sven, I was going to choose Beth since she was my wife, in name at least, beside I had to think of the children. Therefore, on that day I made up my mind that Sven had to go. On the day I bought my house, almost 12 years previously, I had been shocked to discover that the basement of the house was part of a tunnel that also went under a few other houses on that street. The tunnel went toward the river situated a few miles away and the ridge where the houses had been built contained a network of caves joined by this man-made tunnel. Of course, the first thing I did at the time I bought the house was to check if both ends of the tunnel were sealed. On one side, it went about 50 feet where the roof caved in and was blocking it completely, so there was no problem at that end. But on the other side, the side leading towards Sven's house, it went for over 200 feet until a thick oak door, which was still in good condition, was blocking the passage. There was also a small pile of rocks that had fallen from the ceiling in front of the door and this prevented the door from opening. I knew I had nothing to fear from anyone getting into my house by means of the tunnel. The tunnel was quite deep under the house and there were two staircases leading down to it. The first one was made of wood and it led to the basement of the house. From there, the other set of stairs had been carved into the rock and went about 20 feet deeper, giving access to the tunnel itself. I had never tried before to open the thick oak door. For one thing, it was locked with a huge padlock. Then even if it could be forced open after all those years, the pile of rocks blocking it was enough to discourage anyone from trying. But now, since I needed a way to get into Sven's basement without being seen, I was curious to see if the passage on the other side of the door would lead me to his wine cellar. After cutting the old padlock with a saw and then with much squeaking from the hinges, I managed to force the thick door open a couple of inches using a metal bar until I felt a draft of air. Then after long hours of piling rocks on both sides of the wall, I was ready to enter the other side. Holding a flashlight in hand, I managed to squeeze myself through the opening of the partly open door. As expected, after walking less than 100 yards, I found myself standing behind a tall wooden rack loaded with wine bottles. I knew that I was in Sven's wine cellar. With much effort, I was able to squeeze myself between the rack and the wall until I stood in the middle of Sven's wine cellar. Of course, I had already been there a few times with him and I already knew the layout. There were thousands of bottles of assorted wine all neatly stored on racks. At the far end of the cellar there were a couple dozens of wooden barrels full of wine and in the process of aging. I now knew that I had a way to get into his basement without being seen, and before returning back, I took a bottle of his best wine with me. What I intended to do was simple. I knew that he had a couple of batches of experimental wine already fermenting in the upper part of his basement. Soon he was going to move the 5-gallon glass containers into the lower basement for their secondary fermentation, since the temperature there was more appropriate to the slow fermentation. It was my intention to place a thin coating of grease on the second or third step carved in the rock so that it would make him slip while he was carrying the first glass container. The following 2 days I remained home working in my home office and mostly watching Sven's house. As soon as he would arrive home I would go in the tunnel and wait. On the second day I saw him drive home at 4 in the afternoon and I knew that he was going to be checking his wine before eating supper. He always did this when he got home early. It wasn't until early evening that a hysterical and crying Alexandra came running to our house. It took her long minutes before my wife and I were able to get her to tell us that she had found her husband on the floor in the lower basement. I immediately went to check from the top of the stair and I called the police. A couple of hours later his body was removed and his death was declared an accident. Alexandra and especially my wife were devastated by the death of Sven. But deep inside I felt good. For one thing, he had made a fool of me for all those years and he had fathered all of my 3 children thinking I was ignorant of that fact. All that time he must have secretly been laughing at me for raising his children. No, I wasn't sorry at all that he was dead. He had been playing my wife behind my back for many years. I even had heard him saying nasty things about me when he was with my wife. Of course, Beth didn't get pregnant again, but she was in shock and sad for well over 6 months after Sven's death. I knew that she missed her play body very much. But less than a year after her lover's death, she was diagnosed with cancer. When her cancer was detected, it was already too late for her, and 6 months after her diagnostic, she passed away. I had 3 children in the house with me, and everyone truly believed them to be my own, since I was the only one alive that knew the truth about the real father of my children. It now felt as if a tremendous weight had been lifted off my shoulders, since I no longer feared that the truth would suddenly be exposed to everyone. Either out of pity on my family and me, or because she was lonely at home with her husband no longer there, Alexandra soon took to visit us a couple times per day. I didn't care what was her reason, but having her looking after the kids and talking to me in the evening was a blessing for the whole family. Gradually, she got to spend more and more time with us, and after a couple of months she would go to her house only to sleep at night. Of course, the nanny and the maid were still there to help, but Alexandra was slowly beginning to take the place of Beth in the eyes of the children. Then one Saturday evening, leaving the children in the care of the nanny, I took her out to dinner in a restaurant in town, and afterward we went dancing. Of course, what was bound to happen did happen, and I kissed her while still in my car before getting back home. Alexandra was affectionate and very gentle. After a few months, we both knew that we were in love with one another, and less than a year after the death of my wife, I asked her to marry me. We had a wonderful life together. She was the perfect wife to me, and by the time the last of my children left the nest and was attending university, Alexandra and I were still much in love, and we were very rich. 2 of my children were now working with me in my law firm, and even Alexandra's winery in town, which she had inherited from her cheating husband, was making a lot of money. We now had over 50 people working for us there. Now this brings me to the present. Alexandra died in her sleep last year. She was 85, and I know she lived a very happy life with me. Now it is my turn to join her, and that is why I am now anxious to leave this world. I've lived a good life considering my kids aren't mine, but once I'm dead, everyone will know, and my privacy won't be lost forever as it should be. Thank you for joining us on Unraveled Tales, where time itself unravels its captivating tales and reveals the hidden secrets of the past. Prepare to embark on an extraordinary journey as we delve into the depths of history, Reddit stories, bringing you riveting and immersive real stories from different eras. Remember, this channel exists because of your support, and I want it to be a place where we can all come together, learn, and have a great time. Your feedback is vital, and I appreciate every single suggestion and comment you provide. Thank you once again for being such an amazing audience. We encourage you to subscribe to our channel and stay connected with our community. I look forward to reading your valuable advice and working together to make our YouTube channel the best it can be.